Hi, this is Axel from dreamsanctuary.net. Today we're going to look at another dream of mine and how I have interpreted it. Because this is part of a series of video, and in order to not repeat myself too much, I will assume that you have watched the previous video. Also, I recommend reading the article where I have outlined the guidelines that I use for dream interpretation. After making the previous video, I realized that I did not emphasize something key to understanding dreams. That key is the distinction between what happens in the material, objective, outer world and what happens in the symbolic, subjective, inner world. I'm not trying to separate the inner and the outer world here. For instance, I am well aware that there is symbolism in the outer world and there is objectivity in the inner world. But I am making a point that we have to approach them distinctively. What does this mean? I'll refer again to the example of dreaming that one is drowning, though any common dream such as losing teeth or being naked in public would do. Obviously, this has nothing to do with the material reality of what's happening to you. You're not drowning, losing teeth, or being naked in public. So this must mean that, whatever the dream is representing, it is not a material fact about the observable outer world, but it must be something else. That something else is, as we've established in the previous video, that dreams are psychic facts. They are a representation of the dynamics of the inner world, or, as Robert Johnson says, a dream is an X-ray of your psyche. We can now comment on one of the most common mistakes that people make about dreams. Just like the symbolic representation of drowning is different from the act of drowning, then what happens when we dream about other people, especially friends, family members, girlfriend or boyfriend? A lot of people make the assumption that seeing a person in a dream says something about that person. For instance, having a positive dream about an ex-girlfriend or an ex-boyfriend could be a sign that one should try to renew that relationship. Well, this is incorrect. If dreams are representations of the psyche, then the dream is not about the other person, but something that is happening inside you. Thus, dreaming about a family member says nothing about them, but rather that there is an inner dynamic of your inner world that is best represented through the symbol of that family member. Said differently, dreams inform us about ourselves, not about others. Or, more precisely, dreams inform us about ourselves through symbols of others. To illustrate this point, I'd like to tell a story about a dream of mine. One morning, I woke up with an awful nightmare about my mother and my sister threatening me in a dimly lit room. The same day, it happened that we were eating out for dinner at a new restaurant. As soon as I saw the restaurant, I started worrying because it looked exactly like a scene out of my dream. The three of us were together in a dimly lit room. So what if the dream was right and it was going to turn sour? Long story short, nothing happened. This was in fact one of the best nights I spent with my mother and my sister. From that day, I've always fought the tendency to explain a dream externally or concretely, what Jung calls concretism. As much as I would like this to be a hard and fast rule, there are exceptions. The most common one is that, around the death of a loved one, it's not infrequent to see the deceased person in dreams. Another notable exception is that some psychic people are magnets, and they capture things that don't belong to them. Finally, big, archetypal dreams usually show more than just the personal situation. Someone might be interested to know how does one differentiate between normal, subjective dreams and other kinds of dreams. The only answer that I know of is, in cases like this, we have to rely on the integrity of our feeling function to help us distinguish when something feels different. Familiarity and experience will also be key factors. For me, I know when a dream feels like a normal dream because I'm used to them. Thus, I also know when something unusual is happening because the whole experience feels off, feels uncanny. As a summary, the rule of thumb is to always assume it's about the inner world first, and not the outer world. If you're interested in a discussion of the topic of objective and subjective dreams, I suggest watching Dreams, Death and Destiny with Marie-Louise von Franz. Let's now turn to the dream. This dream is titled The Unconscious Going Above the Speed Limit, and I had it in August 2020. I actually had 4 dreams, but I don't remember anything about the first, the second and the third dream, but you'll see it's important. The fourth dream goes like this. I was in a car with my mother and we were going to an amusement park. I was in the back of the car, I was young, around 12 years old, and my mother was driving. I was talking a lot, especially about the fact that the trip was a lot for one day. Suddenly, my mother sped up. I said, "Hey, you're going over the speed limit, we can't do that." She responded with hurt and anger, saying that it's because I don't do anything that she has to do things like that. Let's now go through the key symbols and my spontaneous associations. When I thought about amusement park, back of the car, 12 years old, the first thing that came to mind is a regression to childhood. When I thought about the figure of the mother, well, I didn't think about my mother, but I thought about mother as the role of a mother. And the fact that she's driving means that she's leading. And the symbol that the trip was a lot for one day is associated with the inner conflict I was struggling with, which was too much for me to handle at the time. As you can see, there's a lot of important moments in this dream that do not have any associations. When I complain about the fact that she's going over the speed limit, it's a key moment, but I just don't have any associations with them. For the next step, I'll provide the personal context. The general context was that I was struggling with an inner conflict that I had for weeks at this point. I could not see any solution. In fact, when I went to bed that night, I asked my dreams for a solution. This is a practice called incubation. In that night, I had 3 dreams that were too fuzzy, so I went back to bed hoping for a clearer dream. The truth is that I wanted a solution made for me by the unconscious instead of taking responsibility. We can now go back through the dream step by step. Because this dream is made of one single scene, I'll cut it moment by moment. The first moment is me at the back of the car. I'm talking and complaining that the trip is a lot. This feels like a kind of childlike complaint. The next moment, my mother is speeding up. It leads to dangerous driving, and I say we can't do that. So the feeling here is surprise, fear, I'm agitated and worried. And the last moment is the response of the mother with hurt, anger, and she's blaming me. The feeling here is not hurt or anger, but there's a kind of sadness, which leads to empathy and understanding. The story arc of the dream is first a beginning or a setting with me at the back of the car. It's a regression to childhood. I'm giving up on responsibility. Then there's the drama and tension, which is the forceful intervention of the mother, which leads to dangerous driving. And finally, there's the resolution. It's a re-evaluation of what happened up to that point. And this is my interpretation. From the personal context, there was clearly an infantile attitude of wanting the unconscious to do everything for me. This was pictured as a young version of me, a symbol for a regression to childhood and not taking personal responsibility. Through an exasperated mother figure as well as dangerous driving, the dream is letting me know how irresponsible my attitude was. So how do I know that this is a correct interpretation? Well, it does teach something new to me, and at the same time it has this humbling, grounding effect on the ego, which is always a sign you're looking for. When you're emotionally satisfied with the interpretation, there is still the last step, which is to take action. So I took the matter in my own hands. I reserved some time during the day to go through the inner conflict, following a therapeutic process I'm comfortable with. And I ended up being able to have closure on this, which I initially thought would not happen. I'd like to remind you that at this point I was having this issue for weeks and I did not know what to do. I'd like to make a few comments about this dream. The first one is the difference between being irresponsible and asking for orientation and clarity. It's usual for me to wait for a dream to provide orientation and clarity, but in this case I was being irresponsible. And so this was a very humbling dream, which taught me that I just can't let the unconscious do things for me. It simply isn't how things work. It also taught me the value of consciousness as a partner of the unconscious. Without consciousness, the unconscious appeared distressed to achieve certain things. What is this dream about? I'd say that this dream is about the development of the ego self-axis. The ego self-axis can be defined as the relationship, the vital link between the two centers of the psyche. The ego, the center of consciousness, or the seat of subjective identity, and the self, the totality of the psyche, or the seat of the objective identity. As we can see in the schema, first the ego is contained within the self and exists only as potential. This is the world of childhood. In this case, the ego is fully identified with the totality of the psyche. It is not differentiated from it. As we move to the next figures, we can see the ego starting to develop and detach from the self. We can say that it acquires a conscious autonomy, and we can also say that this creates the ego self-axis as a link between the two centers. On a personal note, I see the building and nurturing of the ego self-axis as a primary task of individuation. Working with one's dreams helps to achieve that, as proved by the dreams we have gone through. There is a lot more to say about the relationship between the ego and the self. In fact, that schema is incorrect. The self being the totality of the psyche means it cannot be represented with the circle, and it cannot be detached from the ego. But all problems aside, this schema still allows us to make a point about the ego-self axis, and that's useful enough. If you're interested in this, I suggest going through Edward Edinger's book, Ego and Archetype. Personally, I hope I can return to this topic if I find another dream that can assist this understanding. In any case, I'll skip to the conclusion of Edinger's paper on the ego-self paradox. If the ego considers itself free and autonomous, it is inflated and commits hubris. On the other hand, if it considers itself completely dependent and determined by a superordinate force, it remains immature and irresponsible. We are thus led to the problem free will versus determinism. Jung has described the situation clearly. In reality, both dependence and freedom are always present, the supremacy of the self and the hubris of consciousness. If ego consciousness follows its own road exclusively, it is trying to become like a god or Superman. But exclusive recognition of its dependence only leads to a childish fatalism and to a world-negating and misanthropic spiritual arrogance. Since the ego-self relation is closely analogous to the son-father pattern, we can expect the former to have all the ambivalence and uncertainty that we know to exist in the latter. Since ego cannot exist without the support of the self, and the self apparently needs the ego to realize it, psychic development can be considered a continuous process of dialectic between ego and self, leading paradoxically to both greater separation and greater intimacy. If you are interested in this kind of analysis, I have a PDF file on my website with 20 of my dreams. This dream was one of them. As always, I hope you found this video helpful. Check the description box for links and references. Until next time.